Hi, I'm Dr. Robert P. Jones. I'm the CEO of Public Religion Research Institute in Washington, D.C., and I'm talking today with Dr. Michele Dillon, professor and chair of the Department of Sociology at the University of New Hampshire, and the author of Catholic Identity, Balancing Reason, Faith, and Power. And today we're going to talk about a new research report released by Public Religion Research Institute on, it's a major new research report on Catholic attitudes on gay and lesbian issues. And this new report offers the most comprehensive national portrait to date of Catholic attitudes on gay and lesbian issues, and includes some previously unreleased data from PRRI's monthly religion and politics polls. So I'll just give a couple of the main findings here, and then we'll jump in. So among kind of the main findings we had, Catholics are more supportive of legal recognitions of same-sex relationships than members of any other Christian tradition and Americans overall. We also found that talking about same-sex marriage as a civil marriage, like you get at City Hall, has significant impact on support. That is, it increases support among Catholics and among the general population as well. Beyond same-sex marriage, Catholic support for rights of gays and lesbian people is really strong and is slightly stronger than the general public overall. And then finally, compared to the general church-going public, despite some of the prominent ways that the Catholic Church has been involved in public debates, Catholics are significantly less likely to hear about the issue of homosexuality from their clergy, but among those who do, they're more likely to hear negative messages than positive messages. So I'll just stop there, and why don't we just jump in here. One of the other things we found, Michele, was this about kind of trends in the Catholic Church, and we found that 1 in 10 Catholics are 1 in 10 Americans are actually former Catholics, that is, those raised in the faith, but now or no longer identify as Catholic. And a majority of those actually cite disagreement with church teachings on abortion and same-sex marriage as among the reasons for leaving the church. And just one other point, that there are actually pretty stark generational differences on these issues. So 56% of Catholics under 35 favor allowing gay and lesbian couples to marry, compared to only 21% of Catholics 65 and older. So why don't we just jump in with, what do you think these trends, mean for the kind of future of the Catholic Church on this particular issue?
Hi, Robbie. Well, you've covered a lot of different data there, and certainly you've given us plenty to talk about. I suppose the first thing I would comment on is this much-mentioned figure of 1 in 10 Americans being previous Catholics, ex-Catholics. I think, that's certainly an interesting number, but I think sometimes we tend to overstate that compared to Protestants, because certainly a lot of Protestants have left, but they stay within the larger Protestant tradition, but they're actually leaving their own particular birth denomination. So I think sometimes we have to just be a little more cautious with this 1 in 10,
right,
if it's
right.
radically different, because, it's much higher for Protestants, except, of course, most Protestants stay within Protestantism, but nonetheless they are leaving the denomination, the particular Protestant denomination of their birth. So I think that the Catholicism that's often emphasized as losing so many of its birth adherents needs to be just put into that context. But certainly
right.
it's a true figure. And
right. Yeah, I mean, no doubt, right, that Pew and others have really shown, the kind of dramatic churn, right, that there is in the American religious marketplace, a lot of religious switching. You're exactly right about that. So sorry, I interrupted you, but go ahead.
No, but I think that's correct. So, yes, and as you say, a lot of the Catholics who leave at least tell posters after the fact that it's because of church teaching, but as Pew also points out, most people who leave their faith tradition tend to do so by drifting away. So it's not necessarily any one big encyclical or statement by church authorities or any one sermon by a priest, I think, that pushes them away, but just sort of a mix of issues. So, but I think certainly, as we know from other studies too, that the church's sexual teachings certainly alienate a lot of Catholics.
Yeah, one striking finding I found there is that that among Catholics, about half actually, don't switch to become, is a little bit fewer than half, switch to some other Christian denomination. So they're not like leaving Christianity, right? They're leaving Catholicism, maybe becoming Episcopalian or Lutheran or something like that. But Pew did find that that about half of them actually remained unaffiliated. So just actually went into the unaffiliated category.
Right, and I think this is actually some of the biggest news that has come out of the study of American religion over the last 10 years is the substantial increase in the number of Americans who no longer have a religious affiliation, because for years, over the generations, it was very few. Everybody felt that they had to identify with some religious tradition, but certainly now we're seeing that that's no longer a cultural pressure, if you like.
Right.
So. And of course, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, what about these generational differences?
Yes,
and on this issue, I mean, this is true for every church. It's not just true for Catholics. That the generational differences on rights for gay and lesbian people are just really stark. 20, 30 points, really among all religious traditions. And what does this mean for the future of this issue? I think among Catholics.
Well, I think in general we have to say that gay rights is this generation's issue, and I think if you talk to any young people, whether in studies or among your own students, you find that they can't understand why there's even so much controversy over gay sexuality, because to them that's a normal sexuality. They've grown up in a time in America particularly where the visibility of gays and the visibility of gay experiences in gay relationships is very much a part of pop culture. And I think they really do scratch their heads and wonder what the older generation, is thinking about when they express either disfavor or disapproval of same-sex issues. So I think it's not just for Catholics, but certainly it's a big change within American Catholicism, is all these young people who are very much in favor of equality for gays, and that certainly is going to be another source of tension among Catholics and between Catholics and official church teaching.
Right. Is that's something you see pretty clearly in your own
yes,
students, including Catholic students?
Yes, I mean, it really is a generational issue. And like abortion, the interesting thing is that abortion attitudes among young people basically mirror those of their parents and grandparents. So there is this, a moderate majority who favor legal abortion, but with some restrictions. Then there's a small minority who think it should be illegal in all circumstances, and another who favor it completely legal without restrictions. And so the generational pattern isn't really there. It's the same as the older generation, whereas on the gay rights issues, any questions, whether it's about the morality of same-sex behavior, whether it's about gay marriage, same-sex unions, really there's a big generational divide. And that, of course, is going to push the culture forward through generational change, because I think, and you probably see this in your own findings from all the various polls you do, that the young people's attitudes, they're going to carry over. They're not going to disappear when these people become 30 or 35. They're going to they've grown up with this attitude, and they're going to want to see it implemented through laws and public policies.
Yeah, well, let's talk about that for a minute. I mean, I think it's a really interesting point, and it's very clear in the data. You can just see it. What we've called at Public Religion Research the decoupling of these two issues. That if you go back to even 2004 with the kind of so-called values voters, kind of wave, you heard these two issues, abortion and same-sex marriage, mentioned in the same breath. Almost all the time in the public debates. And, it is pretty clear that with the younger generation that they're not really joined at the hip in the way that I think it was assumed. What do you think's going on there about why these things are moving in different directions among younger people, and maybe in particular with Catholics?
Well, I think, abortion, because of the various issues it raises about fetal life and all of these moral and scientific questions, I think a lot of people do see that as of a different order, that while they want to respect women's freedom and women's liberties to make particular choices, they're also very conscious that there's another human being's life at issue. And so it has an extra morally charged dimension that I think for most people, gay relationships don't have. They see adults engaging in a romantic and sexual relationship, and they think, what could be more normal and attractive than that? So just as they have their, heterosexuals in relationships, they see gays in relationships, and they don't draw a line between the two. So I think just morally somehow, abortion is an issue that gay rights certainly is not an issue for the younger generation. And indeed, of course, we should say for many who are also older, too.
Yeah, but from the perspective of church teaching, both of these are pretty clear, right? In Catholic teaching, that sort of an opposition to support of or opposing same-sex marriage and opposing legalized abortion are pretty clear. But are you saying experience of younger people is sort of moving them to sort of adhere to one and sort of maybe discount the other?
Well, certainly the church is very clear in its opposition to both, but I don't think, first of all, I'm not sure that many Catholics, never mind the younger generation, would be reading the church's own teachings on these. I mean, they know them, obviously, that the church opposes these or condemns them as mortal sins or what have you, but I don't think that they're necessarily reading the reasons that the church offers. And even if they were, as we know for, at least since, the 1960s, early mid-1970s certainly, Catholics, particularly American Catholics, make up their own minds about things that they feel entitled to make up their minds about. And that certainly includes, very, personal issues of sexuality. And whether they take a liberal view because they are gay or they know people who are gay, or they take a more conservative view because they themselves have qualms about having an abortion, or, I think it's based on their own personal experience rather than on what church teaching says.
Got it. Yeah, no, that's really helpful. Well, why don't we talk about the marriage issue and just kind of unpack that a little bit. So in the report, we found, we ask a three-part question when we ask about this that talks about support for same-sex marriage versus support for civil unions versus support for or no legal recognition at all. Those are the three options when we tend to ask about it. And what we found is when we asked the question that way, that Catholics, that basically about 7 in 10 Catholics support some kind of legal recognition. That is either allowing gay and lesbian people to marry at about 43%, or to form civil unions, an additional 31% there. And so that's a pretty strong, strong support for an issue that, as we just talked about, that the church has a very strong oppositional role, and not just in terms of teachings, but you want to take it beyond teachings to just like visibility, right? I mean, the Catholic bishops in the U.S. have been very visible on this. So even if people aren't reading the teachings, they've got to be fully aware that, the bishops are, somewhere different on this, and the official position of the church, not only just public, but a lot of church resources are going into opposing legislation. And what do you make of that? It's a pretty, I think some people who don't really know that's where Catholics are. When I talk with people sometimes and I say, actually, rank and file Catholics are a bit more supportive of same-sex marriage than the general population is. I think I see a lot of surprise on a lot of people's faces because they take the opposition they see among the bishops to be the position of rank and file Catholics. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's a very strong level of support, but in a sense, I can't say I'm too surprised because, for many years now, Catholics, they are, pretty, advantaged, socioeconomically advantaged group among the American population. And we know that they tend to be liberal on several attitudinal items that we ask in surveys, including, of course, some of these core sexuality issues. Obviously, as I say, abortion is a little different, but even on abortion, the vast majority of Catholics are moderately in favor of, legal choice, legal abortion being available. Yes, it certainly, I think, underscores the gulf that we know exists between the American, not the American, but the church hierarchy in general, the Catholic Church hierarchy, and ordinary people who consider themselves, by the way, very faithful, good Catholics. Mm-hmm. And so I said, but it is interesting that it's such a strong, and all the surveys that you are using, including your own research, plus the other, few and other data that you're bringing into this report, it certainly paints a very clear picture of quite a strong level of support among Catholics.
Yeah. Well, let's ask a kind of bigger picture question here around this, that, the patterns that we see in support for, let's just take same-sex marriage, but it holds true on a number of other issues around rights for gay and lesbians. It's pretty supportive. The general pattern we see is more supportive than the general population by sometimes more and sometimes less, but generally more supportive of the general population and more supportive than most religious groups in the country as well. And the question is, I guess, in terms of if we're thinking about kind of political influence, I guess, how sustainable do you think it is when you've got this kind of gap between the bishops on the one hand that are sort of, very opposed to same-sex marriage, and kind of the rank and file Catholics, nonetheless, in this kind of generally supportive direction. And this may have to do with the kind of quirks of the Catholic Church or the polity of the Catholic Church. But over the long haul, I mean, how sustainable do you think it is for bishops to be able to kind of go into, for example, a politician's office and say, I speak for the Catholic Church, And, if that politician looks at really any public opinion poll from, the Pew Research Center to Gallup to our work at Public Religion Research Institute, they see something quite different. How sustainable do you think this is over the long haul?
Well, I think there's two different parts probably to that answer, Robbie. One is that from the point of view of internal church dynamics, it is highly sustainable that there can be a gap between the average Catholic's beliefs about same-sex marriage compared to the church teaching. I mean, the issue I look back to always is artificial contraception. In 1968, when Humanae Vitae, the encyclical banning birth control, artificial birth control, when that was issued, that seemed to be, it was officially and still is, the theology and the official position of the Catholic Church about birth control. And of course, initially it drove a lot of Catholics away from the church, but within a few years, most of those Catholics had returned and were using birth control. And that's, the bishops clearly have lost the debate over artificial birth control. And it hasn't changed church teaching, by the way. The church's teaching has not shifted, as, that's typical, obviously, because it's a moral issue for the bishops. But they've lost the public, and most people don't even talk about it anymore. I mean, rarely, I think, do priests ever use sermons discussing the sinfulness of birth control, and certainly the Catholic bishops in America or elsewhere don't talk about it. And I think what you're going to see the same with, the whole sets of questions regarding gay rights. I think for the next few years, the bishops certainly will still continue to lobby, particularly at the state level, but also nationally if it comes to federal law, against any kind of broad-scale legalization or any legalization of same-sex marriage. I mean, I think they have to, literally, because it's an issue that so contradicts so much of their own theology of morality and of sexuality and of marriage. So I think in the short term, they have to be very active doing that and will be very active. But, 10 years from now, I think it's going to be a moot issue. And then in terms of the ongoing teaching, I don't think they're going to change their teaching on gay sexuality. But just as with birth control, most Catholics will be ignoring them on that. Yeah.
I mean, the difference is, and let's just make it a little sharper here, just as a way of understanding it. But my guess is that if for example, the bishops were spending the kind of money, like trying to make forms of birth control that the Catholic Church doesn't approve of illegal, in the same way they're spending money sort of opposing same-sex marriage ballot initiatives and other things at the state level and national level. I'm guessing there might be a Catholic uproar about that, given the disparity. As you said, they sort of lost the public battle of that within the churches. Are you thinking like the same thing may occur on this issue over time, where it just may be that the church teaching doesn't change, but the ability to wield that kind of church resources toward the issue might just not be palatable anymore?
Well, the bishops have spent a lot of money against abortion. I mean, going on since long before Roe v. Wade, and certainly after, and still do, and spend really quite a lot of money and resources, lobbying against and trying to have some restrictions put in place. And we don't see any outrage among ordinary parishioners, even though, as I said, the majority of Catholics believe in some form of legal abortion. I think for a lot of Catholics, they make sort of some kind of a compartmentalization about what the bishops in their official capacity do. They might shake their heads about it, and maybe certainly lead some Catholics to give less or not give as much money or give none to the church. And so I think politically you expect to see the bishops involved, because even in terms of their own institutional identity, part of that is to be involved in the public squares, to be out there on these moral issues. And I think particularly maybe with same-sex, because they probably see this as the last issue. I mean, I know there's going to be ongoing issues, in vitro fertilization, and as we get into all the biotechnological reproductive issues, they're going to become more to the forefront, presumably in the near future. But I think certainly for the next few years and the next few election cycles, the bishops will be strong voices in those debates, even though they're not speaking for the majority of Catholic opinion. Yeah.
So I want to pick up on something you said, because I think it's important. You said something that they see it as the last issue, and I wonder if you could unpack that a little bit. And I think I know what you mean, but what exactly is at stake when they see it as the last issue?
Well, I mean, I don't want to use hyperbole, but in a sense, it's so close to church teaching on natural law, which is such a core piece of how the church thinks about and articulates its position on all the sexuality issues. Its opposition to birth control, to the pill, for example, is because, within heterosexual marriage, people are supposed to be open to the reproduction of life.
Right.
That's the natural thing. Similarly, marriage is a natural thing between a man and a woman, as we hear, because they naturally complement each other. Gay sexuality, you do not have that complementarity, and so therefore, if the church gives in, if the church concedes that maybe, from their point of view, gay sex is fine, then they're basically, it seems to me, from a sociological point of view, if not from a theological point of view, they're basically discarding the planks of theology that they've used to justify their opposition to several other things.
Got it, right. So the whole, maybe a chain reaction there if they...
Right, so monogamous marriage, that there shouldn't be any kind of sex outside of marriage, that marriage itself should be heterosexual, and within marriage there has to be openness to life. And they would argue, obviously, you can't have openness to life, at least natural life, life naturally conceived, between two gay men or two gay women, two lesbian women.
Right. Great. Well, let's shift the conversation a little bit to, we were talking a little bit about the bishops, but let's talk about the church, kind of local church, kind of parish church level. We had a few questions in some surveys that we've asked that really talked about, asked people what they were hearing in church. And interestingly enough, we've kind of talked about the prominence of the bishops on some of these issues in the public arena, but interestingly enough, we found that rank and file Catholics were actually less likely to hear about the issue, hear about gay and lesbian issues, the issue of homosexuality in their local parish churches from their local priests. Right. Only 27% said that they had heard anything about this issue from their local priest, and that's compared to 4 in 10 of other religious Americans. So they're actually hearing less about it than other regularly attending religious Americans. There at least seems to be some irony there, or some paradox there. What do you make of that?
Well, I don't think I'm too surprised, in part because, just as I say about contraception, when the bishops and the priests know that things that they're arguing are at odds with what a lot of their own parishioners believe, they tend to not talk about it. And particularly at the local level, which of course is still the most relevant domain of Catholic life for most American Catholics, the local parish, their own local community. Yeah. So while the bishops get a lot of political visibility and public visibility, and certainly in D.C. and elsewhere, and at the state legislatures, maintain a strong presence, really for most Catholics, when you ask them about the church, they're thinking of their local church, and they're very clear about making a distinction between their own local priests and even sometimes their own local bishop, as opposed to the American Catholic leadership in general, or to bishops or the Pope. And so I think certainly some clearly do, as your respondents indicate. Certainly, depending on the issues in a particular state, and certainly over the last few years, it would be interesting to look at your data from a regional or from a state level perspective. Those states that have had same-sex marriage debates because of legislation, I'm thinking even, for example, of Massachusetts, a few years ago, certainly then my understanding was that most priests in their local parishes got up and spoke out against the Supreme Court decision and against any legislation that would be enacted to allow same-sex marriage. But I think that tends to be an aberration. So there's a very specific set of political and legislative events that prompted them to do so. But I think they would have spoken about it maybe for a couple of Sundays at most, and then didn't revisit the issue. So I think it would have been an interesting follow-up question to those respondents who said that they heard. How often do they hear? Because I don't think I'd be very surprised, unless there's some particular pastor who has some bee in his bonnet about gay sex that's so obsessed with it, that would talk about it week after week, or even on any kind of a frequent basis. Right.
Yeah, and we did find that when they did hear about it, the messages were overwhelmingly negative. That is opposed to, approving of gay and lesbian issues.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Well, I think it would be controversial if any local priest, no matter how liberal, came out and said that, well, the church disagrees with him, he disagrees with the church and thinks gay sex is fine or gay relationships are fine. So, I think if you're going to hear about it, it's going to be more negative than positive.
Right. Great. Well, I was going to sort of along these lines. We asked, especially in the wake of a lot of really tragic suicides by gay and lesbian youth in the fall last year and continuing, and we asked kind of the Americans what they thought about, one, like how they would grade their churches and how they were handling the issue of homosexuality. And we asked both churches in general and their own church. And, generally what you see is that Americans basically gave largely low marks to churches overall. That is, they kind of gave them a D, or more gave them a D or an F, they gave them an A or a B by a significant margin. But they were more generous toward their own churches. But among Catholics were actually harsher toward their own churches than other religious adherents were. Only 39%, for example, gave their church an A or B for how they're handling the issue of homosexuality, whereas most churches would give, a majority gave their churches, their own churches, an A or a B, despite the fact they thought the church in general wasn't handling it that well. And I'll throw in the other finding, here too, is that we had 7 in 10 Catholics who said that they saw a connection, at least some connection, between the messages coming out of churches that they either contributed a lot, 33%, or a little, 37%, to higher rates of suicide among gay and lesbian youth. And we were actually surprised to see the numbers that high. We didn't really think that people would, make that link as strongly as they did. And, this question, I'm going to kind of ask it a little differently, kind of, puts the question into the realm of kind of pastoral care, right? And a little less in the realm of policy and politics. And, I'm wondering if you have seen, any movement. Whereas, we talked about the fact that, the kind of official church teachings, particularly that have to do with policy and what the bishops are and aren't going to support, are pretty well lined out and don't look like there's going to be a lot of change anywhere there soon. But I'm wondering if you've seen, and I know you've done some research on this, places where there is something different happening despite the fact that those official church teachings aren't changing, where there's movement, say, within the church to provide different venues of pastoral care for gay and lesbian youth, or to kind of change some of these dynamics that, at least when we did the survey in the fall, that, people have a pretty harsh judgment of how churches have handled this issue.
Right. Well, I think, it's such a tragedy, and we've certainly had recent instances of, in the public domain of, teenage suicides, gay teenage suicides. I mean, the bottom line remains that despite the huge increase in American, not just Catholic, but in American public approval of same-sex rights and morality issues and the rights of gays to teach and to marry and do all kinds of things, to serve in the military, gays still face a tremendous amount of discrimination in our society. So despite all of the advances that they've made, you're still really a second-class citizen, it would seem, in terms of local experiences. And so I think for young people, particularly who are growing up with a lot of pressures, they're in high school, there's academic pressures, there's lots of social peer pressures, there's sexuality pressures, any sorts of negative messages that come from anywhere, whether within their own family, within the churches, from television, about being gay, certainly has to add to a set of other negative messages that can be, unfortunately, a tipping point in terms of, negative choices for some, that they feel that there really is no space for them in the society, that they really are an abnormality. So I think that's a big issue. I think perhaps because of these public incidents recently, there will be more attention to that, just as there is now to the issue of bullying in general. And certainly then at a pastoral level, from within the church's perspective, there are groups, certainly Dignity stands out as, for a long time now, being a place of Catholic and gay worship. Of course, it operates outside the institutional approval of the church, but nonetheless, certainly I know from my own research a few years ago, that these are very committed Catholics. These are Catholics who can't give up their Catholicism, just as they also cannot give up their sexuality. So it's a very powerful combination of two very, strong forces, their religious identity and their sexual identity. And so Dignity certainly has been successful in providing a lot of gay and lesbian Americans with a worship space that reflects and affirms who they are as gays and as Catholics. Yeah. But by the time people get to Dignity, they've already themselves often experienced a lot of personal trauma. And I think in particular those teenage years are a very vulnerable time for everyone, but particularly for gays in our society, despite, as I said, the great changes that have happened. Yeah. And so it is an issue, but then we also know, in fairness, that a lot of priests who definitely theologically and morally oppose gay behavior, gay sexual behavior, and bishops too, they nonetheless do engage in a lot of pastoral outreach and pastoral care towards gays. And so, you hear anecdotal evidence. This isn't really documented empirically, but you do hear a lot of anecdotal evidence in different parishes and different dioceses about individual bishops, not just priests, who, administer, to AIDS patients, who really do want to reach out at the individual level. But at the same time, of course, they have to represent the Church's teaching, condemning, as it does, that sexual acts are objectively disordered and are immoral. So that's, I think, a difficult line that Church leaders have to face. So regardless of their own personal opinions on the issue, and despite their own good pastoral work, they still cannot ultimately, they could, obviously, with repercussions, challenge the Vatican teaching on these issues.
Right. Say a little bit more about dignity, because I know you spent some time in those communities and really studying them. And just for folks who may not be kind of familiar with them, about how are they sort of structured as completely separate kind of church entities? Are they meeting within existing Catholic parishes?
Well, it varies, but they started out back in the 1970s when there was this, the post-Vatican II era, of lots of Catholics searching for new ways to be Catholic, and it also, of course, coincided with the gaining of strength of the gay rights movement, nationwide and across culture. But Dignity was founded by committed Catholics who happened to be gay and who wanted to do something as a sort of a social community space so that gays could find fulfillment for their religious identity. And so initially, for several years, a lot of these chapters of Dignity, as they were called, met within the confines of a parish. So just as you have a group meeting on a Monday night or a Saturday night or Sunday night to do certain kinds of special liturgies or special kinds of meetings, many of them actually participated in the actual church parish life of the church. But back in the 70s, I'm afraid the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, which obviously oversees issues of doctrine, were concerned about the rising prominence of gay sexuality in the culture, and in particular also in the Catholic Church, and became very strict about issuing statements condemning. And that's really, if you look at the recent history of gay rights within the Catholic Church, you can really go back to the mid-1970s when the Vatican issued declarations discussing these acts as I've said, objectively disordered. And so then, in response to this Vatican crackdown, really, on sexuality, a lot of local bishops asked various Dignity chapters not to celebrate their masses and their events within the church. And so in several instances, these chapters moved out and moved to a Protestant church or some other space. So again, it varied, as we often see with these contested Catholic issues. It depends on diocese to diocese. But and then, of course, again, 10 years, that was 1976, and 10 years later, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith issued another statement condemning the idea that you could be gay and Catholic, because despite their earlier declaration, they said that it seems to be seen in some quarters that to be gay and Catholic is okay, when they specifically said that it wasn't okay. So Rome, and Cardinal Ratzinger in particular, was very much at the forefront of that condemnation. And so that led then local American bishops to take a more negative view toward Dignity. But Dignity continues, to be a vibrant, religious outlet for a lot of gay Catholics.
Right. So there's something really interesting in that about, so a group of gay Catholics for whom their Catholic identity is really important, finding at least a space in Protestant churches, right? It's kind of an interesting phenomenon.
Well, I should say the Protestant churches are usually, Episcopalian church, so they're not necessarily evangelical, but there is a similar movement within the evangelical church too, because I think, again, as we understand more and more about the complexity of sexual identity, even among very conservative traditions, religious traditions, there is, I think, increased awareness and appreciation that sexuality is not this cut-and-dry thing that we can just simply condemn, but it's part of human nature, and then how people act on that is also part of a particular society, and we have to accommodate somehow the diversity of our parishioners, of our laity, within our church structures.
Yeah. Yeah, the other thing I'm thinking about, so we've covered kind of policy and kind of church, kind of what people are hearing in church, then messages coming out of churches. I mean, the other place where we asked some questions about was really about kind of moral and theological views. Because, it might be one thing to say, well, okay, rank and file Catholics have actually moved somewhere politically where they're willing to sort of think maybe they hold sort of negative evaluations about gay and lesbian sexuality, but they're willing to sort of, because of separation of church and state, kind of hold those at bay and not push them into the public realm. And so maybe that's why, there's been this shift. But, it's interesting, when we actually looked at kind of moral evaluations, theological evaluations among ranking and file Catholics, we actually see quite a consistent picture. It's not that they're sort of moving in public policy support and not here, so just a couple, like for example, we had less than 4 in 10 Catholics say homosexual behavior is morally wrong. So that's, less than a majority there. And in fact, a plurality of Catholics in Pew's research actually said they don't even consider homosexual behavior to be a moral issue. And then we have, when we asked actually about, and put it in the context of theology and sin, even, we had a majority of Catholics say that they don't believe that sexual relationships between two adults of the same gender is a sin, and they overwhelmingly reject the idea that homosexual sexual orientation can be changed. So it's a pretty consistent profile. It's kind of striking. It goes from policy to morality to theology. And do you think, or do you see a foot? There's obviously. And maybe we've covered this ground, but just let me ask it again. Do you see afoot like a movement to kind of, to see this data and to, really push back against it, or do you really think that from what you see in trends in the Catholic Church, that there is a kind of, see the writing on the wall kind of approach to this? So either kind of gearing up for kind of the real battles, particularly with younger Catholics, or to kind of see the writing on the wall and try to figure out how the Church can sort of maintain its teachings even with this shift all the way down to the level of theology among rank and file Catholics.
Well, I agree with you that it's, for Catholics, mostly it's not a moral issue. They don't see these social, sexual issues in moral terms. Now, that might be a problem, but from a sociological point of view, they're not making this decision, I morally believe X, but policy-wise, I feel I should support Y.
Right.
I think for them, it's just a non-issue. And, just if, again, we go back, A, contraception, but B, divorce. Divorce is still a mortal sin in Catholic teaching. But, most Catholics don't necessarily think of it as a mortal sin. They think of it as something either they need or they don't need or whatever. But it's not, they don't see it in moral terms primarily. Some obviously do. And so it's the same with all these other issues. I do still think abortion is different, but the morality there is not simply a Catholic morality. It's more a larger morality about life and who has rights to life. So I don't see it as a Catholic doctrinal issue as such. And so, yes, the writing is on the wall, I do believe. What that means ultimately is I don't know that there's going to be necessarily a big battle, because there never really has been a big battle. The Catholic Church is very good at containing its dissent. So despite all the numbers that you cited at the beginning, that 1 in 10 are ex-Catholics, that's true. Catholics are going to come and go. But most Catholics who are Catholic nonetheless disagree with some aspect of church teaching, and I don't see that going to change too tremendously in the next decade or the next several decades. That's part of being Catholic, it seems, is to disagree, but to still stay within the larger tradition, because I think for many Catholics the tradition is more than just about church teaching on sexuality or social justice or whatever piece that they either agree or disagree with. So that there's a larger set of considerations for them that want them to stay as Catholic, even if they, or even as they, disagree very intensely about some of these issues with the church, or with the church authorities.
Well, let me throw it back to you. I've sort of been kind of guiding us along here. Is there anything you in particular wanted to talk about before we kind of wrap up?
Well, I know, Robbie, one of the other things that you included in your surveys was looking at Catholics as swing voters, and of course 2012 is going to be another important and exciting, presumably, election year. Catholics voted, as you show, and others that overwhelmingly, or at least to some extent overwhelmingly, for Obama, and yet, of course, things have changed rather dramatically in the last 2 years. How do you, as you yourself, look at all these polls, and you're in Washington, so you're more in touch with the pulse? What role do you see Catholics as swing voters in the next election cycle? What role do you think they'll play?
My favorite quote here, I've actually heard it from E.J. Dillon, and I'm sure it's attributable to someone else, but there is no Catholic vote, and it's important. is something I've heard him say. It is remarkable that Catholics are really a bellwether constituency, and they look remarkably like as a whole, as like the general population on any number of issues. But it is the case that we've sort of seen them swing, and one of the interesting underlying tensions here that we haven't really touched on that much, but is the sort of political tensions between white Catholics and Hispanic Catholics. That for example, in the last election, I mean, you're right. Although what we saw was a really big divide between white Catholics and Latino Catholics. So, for example, white Catholics actually voted and preferred McCain over Obama, 52% to 47%. So not a huge movement, but Latino Catholics overwhelmingly supported Obama, right? So 72% of Latino Catholics supported Obama, and that's actually a huge pickup even over Kerry among Latino Catholics. A lot of that's probably over immigration and other related issues as well. So I think this tension between kind of white Catholics and Latino Catholics is really something, so really the thing to watch going forward. We look way back in history. Catholics were the kind of quintessential Democratic, kind of solid Democratic vote, but that's been really changing in the last 20 years. They're really the swing vote, and you really do see this movement, and we saw it in 2010 too. A kind of swing back toward the Republican Party among Catholics in the House votes. With a group like this, it's hard to prognosticate about what's coming down. I think it's going to with a group that swings. A lot depends on the candidate. A lot depends on the issues that are at the forefront. And how this is going to play. One big question I thought I'd ask you is, we've talked about kind of abortion. We've talked about same-sex marriage. There's this whole body of Catholic social teaching as well that. We're in the midst of an economic crisis, and while we're on voting here, what's your sense of whether sort of this body of Catholic social teaching and Catholics voting, maybe less on life issues or less on cultural issues and more on kind of these social justice issues? Do you think that's sort of afoot, or do you think that sort of the Catholic social teaching maybe, I don't know, might not have that much coherence for Catholics today, or what's your thought on that?
Well, I think for a lot, particularly older Catholics, the sort of the 40-plus Catholics, the Church's social teaching is extremely important to them. And so, economic justice, opposed to the death penalty, care, health care, for example, we saw all those polls showing that, which is, of course, this is one sort of interestingly ironic point, is that, the bishops clearly, or at least traditionally were until Obama's plan, were in favor of universal health care. And that really is the position that an awful lot of Catholics also endorse. That, of course, has become more complicated by the healthcare politics and debates of the last couple of years. But for a lot of Catholics, those social justice issues are extremely important. And yet, at the same time, for other Catholics, because these Catholics who voted for McCain, a lot of those are, it's not. I think it's driven by economic rather than social or moral, so-called moral issues. It's the issue of taxation. It's a very American issue. What's it going to do to my income and my assets? I don't want to pay more taxes. So I think there's some interesting tensions here, among Catholics over these social justice issues, and quite apart from any of the social sexuality issues. And it's hard to know, as you say, it depends on the candidate and, what issue comes more to the fore in 2012. But social justice is still a very important part for a lot, and certainly even for the younger generation, even though we often hear that they're selfish. We know from research on civic engagement that young people are very involved in helping their community, whatever form that might take. But there's a lot of emphasis, from high school onwards, and certainly in college, about students being involved in community service, and that's certainly something that actually can bring some of them back to the church, or those who are already in church. It sort of reinforces that ethic. So I think the social justice issues, despite the recession, and maybe even because of the recession, where we see more extremes of poverty, it will sort of renew maybe some of the Catholic contributions to that debate.
Great. Well, I think I'm about ready to wrap it up. You have anything else you want to talk about before we do?
No, that's fine. I think we seem to cover a lot of issues.
Great. Well, so this is Robert P. Jones. I'm the CEO of Public Religion Research Institute in Washington, D.C., and I've been talking with Professor Michele Dillon at the University of New Hampshire, and have been talking about our new report on Catholic attitudes on gay and lesbian issues. It's the most comprehensive national report to date on Catholic attitudes on these issues, and has some previously unreleased data in it on PRRI's monthly religion and politics poll, and you can find it on our website at www.publicreligion.org/research. Well, thanks, Michele, and
thank you,
I
Robbie.
look forward to continuing conversation later.
Sure. Thanks, Robbie.
All right, thanks.
Take care.